This is a work session of the Board of Trustees of the Village of Sleepy Hollow. We're going to begin tonight with a continuation of a public hearing on extending the hours on sidewalk cafes or on seating outside of restaurants, which we began last week. And we also have a public hearing that we're opening tonight on floating zones. Mr. Giacchio, could you read the notices of the public hearings? And I'd like to conduct them both at the same time in the interest of efficiency.
Please take notice, the Board of Trustees of the Village of Sleepy Hollow has called for the continuation of a public hearing on Tuesday, December 3rd, 2019 at 7 p.m. or soon thereafter in Village Hall, 28 Beekman Avenue, Sleepy Hollow, New York, to hear and consider comments from members of the public on the proposed local law entitled, "A Local Law Amending Chapter 362 of the Code of the Village of Sleepy Hollow entitled Streets and Sidewalks Relative to Sidewalk Displays and Sidewalk Cafes." All persons are entitled to attend and be heard at said hearing. Village Hall is accessible to all disabled persons. By order of the Board of Trustees, Paula A. McCarthy Tompkins, Village Clerk, November 26, 2019. Please take notice, Board of Trustees of the Village of Sleepy Hollow has called for a public hearing on Tuesday, December 3rd, 2019 at 7 p.m. or soon thereafter in Village Hall, 28 Beekman Avenue, Sleepy Hollow, New York, to hear and consider comments from members of the public on the proposed local law entitled, "A Local Law Amending Chapter 450 of the Code of the Village of Sleepy Hollow entitled Zoning to Establish a Strategic Property Redevelopment Floating Zone pertaining to existing underutilized municipal properties in Sleepy Hollow." All persons are entitled to attend and be heard at said hearing. Village Hall is accessible to all disabled persons. By order of the Board of Trustees, Paula A. McCarthy Tompkins, Village Clerk, November 12th, 2019.
Thank you, Mr. Giacchio. Before we ask for public comments on either or both of the public hearings, I asked Dave Smith to do some intro remarks on the floating zone, just to set the context for folks who are not as familiar with the idea. Mr. Smith.
Great. Thank you and good evening. For the record, David Smith, Principal with Planning and Development Advisors, Planning Consultant to the Village of Sleepy Hollow. Good evening. So the public hearing on the Strategic Property Redevelopment Floating Zone is essentially a continuation of the discussion that Professor John Nolan had with you and your board back in September. And I think he went through in great detail the kind of the underpinning of zoning, land use zoning, how it applies at the municipal level, the different responsibilities for implementing land use zoning, the village board, planning board, as part of an overall land use strategy for enacting redevelopment within Sleepy Hollow. So to set a little bit of the background, Professor Nolan provided some background on the concept of zoning and the floating zone. While this was happening, the Local Development Corporation, the Sleepy Hollow LDC, was investigating the opportunities for redevelopment of the former UAW property. And one of the aspects that they considered was a zoning concept that would allow for redevelopment of that property to the benefit of the Village of Sleepy Hollow. And so an initial draft of the zoning, this floating zone concept, was prepared. It was circulated to Professor Nolan, who provided some additional comments. And so what you have before you is a proposed local law that responds to some of the concepts that were outlined in the village's comprehensive plan update, including related to municipal services, the relocation and consolidation of those services. And so how can the village best capture the potential redevelopment of some of its municipal properties as it considers consolidation in the future? I'll quickly go through kind of the guts of the zoning, and then if you have any questions, open it up to your board or to the public. So the strategic property redevelopment floating zone. The intent is to enable the redevelopment of existing underutilized municipal properties so they may be returned to the tax rolls for mixed-use, affordable, or market-rate housing, and to provide criteria for the development of these types of uses. So under the development standards and general requirements, we have essentially three criteria. The property must be owned by a municipal or government-related entity, such as the Village of Sleepy Hollow or the local development corporation. The property must be located within 1/2 mile from a Metro North train station or within 1,000 linear feet from a dedicated bus stop. And I think this gets back to some of the issues raised in the comprehensive plan about promoting what they call transit-oriented development, meaning development that doesn't necessarily rely specifically on a single vehicle development or cars, but that somebody could access either Metro North or they could access mass transit through the Beeline bus system. And the third is the property must be located within the inner village as illustrated on Figure 7 of the Village of Sleepy Hollow Comprehensive Plan. Again, that's to kind of focus, I think, the efforts on redevelopment within the inner village that probably needs it the most within Sleepy Hollow. So there are certain bulk and dimensional standards for the strategic property redevelopment floating zone properties. The underlying zoning is what applies, but an applicant may come in and request to have certain restrictions waived or modified with respect to zoning, and that includes that a floating application of this floating zone to a particular piece of property may allow for a non-residential use to occur on upper floors of mixed-use buildings as part of a special permit process. So right now, in your commercial district, all the retail or commercial components have to occur on the first floor. And so in this case, there may be an opportunity where the property presents certain opportunities with view sheds to take advantage of from a commercial standpoint. And so there's an opportunity through the special permit review where that requirement could be waived. There are the minimum lot size dimensions, FAR, which is floor area ratio, coverage, and open space setback requirements. Some of those may be requested to be waived based on the configuration of the property and the underlying zoning. Again, that would be part of a special permit process, and I'll go through that process as we move through the presentation. And lastly, given that there is this transit-oriented development aspect of redevelopment, and because we've targeted the distance of properties to either Metro North or bus line, there's an opportunity for the village to waive certain parking requirements. So, and that's always a consideration, particularly with redevelopment in congested or confined areas like the inner village. And you can go through any of the river towns and you have pretty much the same thing where you've got older properties that are somewhat confined, but you still have very convenient access to mass transit. And so there's perhaps, given the planning aspects, to reduce the amount of parking. So from a procedural standpoint, if an applicant is applying for any of these waivers from these standards or requirements, it's a special permit application to your board. So they would have to come in. There are a series of documents and analysis that they need to provide to you in order to better evaluate the request for the waiver. That includes conceptual level plans. It may include analysis related to traffic, water, sewer, utilities. One of the aspects that I've included in a number of the projects like this that I've had throughout Westchester County is also a fiscal evaluation, so that the community has a better understanding of what the fiscal impacts are of redeveloping a certain property, and the potential benefits that may accrue to the village, and then the potential impacts. The conditions for any special permit approval: the proposed SPR will be in harmony with the appropriate and orderly development of the village's inner village neighborhood. The proposed SPR will not hinder or discourage the appropriate development and use of adjacent lands. The proposed SPR is consistent with the policies and purposes of the village's local waterfront revitalization program and comprehensive plan. So again, we're going back to documents that have been created and crafted by the village and adopted by the village as official policy for redevelopment, and that the proposed SPR is otherwise in the public interest. Bless you. So as part of the waiver requirements that I had indicated earlier, there are, the village has the opportunity to incentivize development. And it may be for, again, from the increased building bulk, floor area ratio, building height, relief from setbacks, the request for non-residential use on upper floors, or relief from parking or loading. So with respect to the potential incentives, we've listed those as part of the legislation. And again, this is modeled more or less the incentive program after your existing code, what's in there for an area like the RF district, which has, and the Southern Riverfront Overlay District, which has these incentives in them for allowing for additional height and other development criteria. So the incentives include the provision of affordable housing as defined by Westchester County, provisions of improvements to specific parks within the village, and these are located more or less within the inner village: Barnhart Park, Reverend Sykes Park, Margata Courts, and Horan's Landing. And then streetscape, landscape improvements in the form of street lighting, plantings, sidewalk improvements, benches, and other similar amenities that you would find within the village downtown commercial area. So the process going forward, there still would be a site plan approval that would be required as part of the planning board. And then lastly, with respect to timing, if the village grants the floating zone to land on a particular piece of property, and 2 years or 24 months from the date of approval, if there hasn't been any site plan approval granted for that project, then the property reverts back to its initial zoning. And that was a kind of an adjustment that Professor Nolan had suggested to make sure that if somebody is going to come into the village and make a proposal for redevelopment, they have to be serious about it, and they have to get it undertaken within at least 2 years to keep it moving. So, Mayor, members of the board, that's a quick synopsis of the proposed legislation. I'd be happy to answer any questions that you may have or the public may have.
Thank you, Mr. Smith. So I'll open it up to public comments and/or comments from the board. Would anyone like to address the board on the matter of either public hearing? So extending the calendar for outdoor seating at cafes and restaurants, and the proposed amendment to the code to add the floating zones. Yes, sir. I was going to say, use the microphone that used to be in the middle of the room.
I missed one meeting, you changed it.
Yeah, and this really isn't Sleepy Hollow either, so. Yes, sir.
I'd like to wish everybody a happy belated Thanksgiving. I'd like to thank you, Mr. Mayor, for having my comments be read into the public record last week. And for any trustees that were not at the meeting last week, I'll summarize by saying I oppose any amendment to 362 because I think it's unjust to change a code that alters the quality of life to a resident that is already at the facility. A mixed-use building that has a facility that allows outdoor seasonal seating is absolutely it's a change of life. And right now, it's a 6-month period, and I believe that's where it should be left. If the village believes that new developments should have year-round outdoor seating, then it should be amended to only allow it in new communities, new mixed-use buildings. Thank you for your time. Again, happy belated Thanksgiving.
Thank-
And on the code for the floating zone, I would greatly appreciate it if the mayor, in his eloquent fashion, could put what this gentleman just said into layman's terms. Thank you.
I thought I said it in layman terms.
I
Apologies.
I thought you did too. Thank you,
Yeah.
Mr. Savitsky. The, I'll try to do that, but not right now. Part of it is like the 1, 2, 3, the easy part, and the most important part is it has to be municipally owned property. So it's not open. It's in fact very tight. And there's not a lot of municipally owned property that is, would be enticing to redevelop. If you took all of it, 2 different firehouses, this building and the firehouses and the police station in it, those are the primary ones. The UAW facility, I'm sorry, 193 Beekman. I'm trying to change to get the address instead of that is counted as municipally owned because it's owned by the local development corporation. Most, if not all, of the other municipally owned properties in the village are parkland, and there's all kinds of things that make it incredibly difficult to ever change parkland designations. So it's a handful of properties that would be potentially affected by this if we adopted it. So that's the thing I think is the most, to me, that's the most important part of this. And gives us a potential opportunity to redevelop some sites. Could it be extended by some future administration in the future? Well, of course. It could also be taken away by some future administration as well through this same process. The other things to keep in mind, I think, are that it's a slightly, depends on your point of view, if you're a developer, a slightly more onerous process than the normal seeker process, because there's been some things that have been added in that make it make you try to prove some things you wouldn't normally have to do, or show some things, or demonstrate some things. For us, quite frankly, it's an opportunity to use this as a test case. Oh, and of course, the DPW facility, the right across River Street from you guys, which has already been rezoned, of course, but it potentially could be part of this as well. I think the best way to understand it is the way, well, the way I understand it anyway. Maybe that's not the best way, but the way I understand it is this is really a test case for us to take a look at how does this work with 193 Beekman, and do we get a result out of the redevelopment of that site that this board thinks is good for the village, this will be an opportunity to see if it works, if floating zone works, if the redevelopment works in a way that we would like it to. And then potentially we could move on to other sites. But it's also important to remember that this is not as of right. It's which current zoning is. So on the DPW site, for example, you could look at what it was rezoned to and say, okay, that's what you can do. And there's no given here that would be changed. Could it be if we adopt this? Yes, but it's not an automatic by any means at all. Likewise, if we were going to create a new facility for the police and Village Hall and the fire companies that are here, and redevelop this property, there's a potential to do something like that as well. But those are the kinds of things that are like, well, where are we going to move to? There's so much that has to go into that before we even begin to seriously look at doing something like this space. That anything like that is pretty far down the road if we were going to do it at all. So it's really, I think the focus here is we're looking to create a tool that we think will help us at 193 Beekman. And then we're going to evaluate and see if it worked well, and then see if we're going to apply it someplace else. So, hope that's plain English. I thought Mr. Smith was usually, he's a hockey coach. It's, you can't get much plainer English than that.
Yeah.
Well, you can, but he didn't, he left all those words out.
Right.
You didn't say offsides.
Right, yeah.
So that's my explanation. I hope that illuminates it in some way. Does anybody else want to address the board on the matter of either public hearing? Yes, ma'am.
Hello, Kristen Harris, 47 Meister Street. I came to speak mostly about the floating zone, but I just will mention briefly my opinion on the other matter, and I guess I'm in favor of extending the time that outdoor cafes could be servicing people. In terms of the floating zone, I was excited, and I think it was September when I saw Professor Nolan here talking to you all about it. It's a concept that I've heard about, and it seems like a great tool to be utilized, and also the fact that you're kind of taking steps already, implementing things that we were outlining in the comprehensive plan is great. When I read through the draft, I guess I think it's a great first step. I'm hoping it's the first step of many. I'd like to see eventually a floating zone that's even more maybe inclusive, to including properties beyond municipal owned. That's a little more specific too, in terms of right now it's leaving a lot of options and possibilities available that may be granted to a potential developer that comes before you. But I think if I were a developer before you, I'd feel more confident if I said, okay, if I do these things, then I'm awarded these things. And it's not spelled out. It's very maybe intentionally murky and gray, so that there's a lot of discretion on your side, and I completely respect and understand that. But in terms of being more attractive to somebody to come in and develop, I think that might be something to consider. And then the only other specific comment I had was related to the incentive feature related to affordable housing. It says here, up to 10% of the total number of units. I guess I would hope it would be a minimum of 10%, which is a pretty standard number utilized elsewhere. And then even there defining, it says affordable housing as defined by Westchester County, but I know sometimes there's questions in play as to what AMI is that based on, what percentage, and looking at what needs we have specifically here, and there's a lot of need in the middle. So defining that a little more specifically up front, I think, is helpful also for developers, because then they can calculate in what does that mean to them, is it going to work or not, whatever project they're contemplating. So, but thank you very much for having this public hearing and already talking about floating zones and looking to implement them.
Thank you.
Mayor, may I just add, I don't know if Kirsten recognized herself. She's a member of the planning board here in the Village of Sleepy Hollow.
I think she knows who she is.
Yeah,
She just
well,
didn't identify
Yeah,
herself.
yeah. But it's important because this legislation needs to be sent to the planning board for review and recommendation. So you'll have another opportunity, the planning board will have another opportunity to review this before it's finalized, or before you have an opportunity to vote on it.
So, question for you, Dave.
Yeah.
Let's say we approve the floating zone concept. How long does it take to go through that process, A, and then, what would can you just explain a little bit about what a developer would have to do, to submit? I mean, are we going to create an RFP process, or how would it all work out?
So the procedurally, from a timing standpoint, to have the legislation approved and adopted. So one of the immediate next steps would be for the planning board to discuss it at their next meeting, which is December 19th. And there's a time frame. Typically, they need to respond within 30 days back to the village board on a review and recommendation. So there's a time frame where you need to wait for comments from the planning board. I believe this has also been circulated to Westchester County. And typically, they have a municipal referral review where they may provide some additional comments. And depending on the extent of those comments, you may want to have the legislation revised, so that may take a little bit of time. You would want to continue the public hearing. So I suspect probably within the first quarter of 2020, you may be in a position to say we would like to adopt this and move it forward. So that would be the response to your first question. The second one, with respect to the development process, what's contemplated is that if the legislation is in place, that at least for 193 Beekman, the LDC would go out to a developer's RFP or a request for expression of interest, something along those lines. And I believe I know at the last meeting that I was at with the LDC before your board, we described the extent of the evaluation that the LDC has done with their engineering team to more or less put together a kind of almost a full build-out under existing zoning. So, and the benefit of going through that process is that when you go out to the development community, they understand where the critical pieces of infrastructure are needed in order to move a project forward, the parking, the access, you have the viaduct, those things. So they understand that those are potentially issues that contribute to the cost of development. And the benefit of the legislation is that they may need relief from, let's say, a zoning setback or relief from parking. And parking has a cost to it, a development cost to it. They may ask for additional bulk to get additional density. And in return for that, they need to provide affordable housing. They may need to provide some other incentives. And partly in response to Kirsten's comment about the requirements being a little bit murky, that's done on purpose so that there's an opportunity for the village and a prospective developer to talk through kind of the economic advantages to both and to work through and come up with a deal or approval that works for both parties. So what's incumbent upon a development team is understanding what the economics are particularly in the Sleepy Hollow market, and you have a project that's right across the tracks that is kind of a barometer of what you can expect from development potential. So they would need to do their own due diligence. They would have their own kind of internal pro formas that they would evaluate where the project makes a profit for them and where they can provide some benefits to the village. So they would need to come up with traffic analysis and, again, the fiscal analysis, any engineering. One of the view sheds is down the Beekman Avenue corridor, so they would need to take that into account. That's part of your local waterfront revitalization program. And that was also some of the background material that the LDC had commissioned as part of this initial evaluation of redevelopment of 193 Beekman.
I think I prefer the descriptor gray over murky,
Yes.
Especially when you're talking about government decisions.
Yes.
And I think it goes back to something else, and that was the staying away from as of right. So I think a way I would also explain it to folks is like, yeah, we could apply this floating zone to this property. Here, you have to do, it has to fit all of these criteria, and you have to do all of these kinds of things, and then you might get it. Instead of, it's in this, it has to fit this criteria, and if you do all of these things, you do get it. We want to make sure that we always have, maintain that control with this board and with future boards to evaluate the project in a way that it doesn't become an automatic for folks. I mean, yes, the way it's written right now, it's village-owned property anyway, so of course we control the project because we could decide not to sell it to somebody. But it's really keeping it a lot of control right here with the members.
Could we potentially go as far as upfront taking control with some sort of a quasi-special permit where we decide this is what we want to see happen on this piece of property, as opposed to waiting from developers as to what they might like to do? In other words, we want to maximize the value of that property. We have specific things in mind. We have specific incentives we might be willing to offer, and sort of pre-package it, which would make it even more attractive to the village and potentially a developer, because they don't have to go through certain procedures that take up an awful lot of time and an expense associated with that time. So it's sort of an enhanced floating zone, if you know what I'm saying.
Yeah, you could do that. I would be a little bit hesitant only because the village isn't necessarily in the development business. And there's no disrespect, but the developers in the world know what they need in order to make a project like that work. I think part of what the legislation tries to allow is enough flexibility so that they could come in with a package that works for both sides. And I would be concerned that in trying to craft something that may have that may limit flexibility, or may say that you prescribes that you need to provide X number of units when that may not work, or they may want to do something entirely different with the property. So that would be my. It doesn't mean you can't get it done. It's just a lot more work. In my mind, it would be a lot more work to try and.
I'm not suggesting that we would do this in-house. We would be working in concert with commercial real estate expertise who have a really good idea as to what's attractive right now to the
Right.
development community,
Yeah.
as opposed to not knowing.
Right.
I think there's a big difference there.
Yeah, and I think part of what the LDC was trying to accomplish with this effort was to eliminate some of that uncertainty and have some certainty with respect to timing with the application, so that this type of zoning is in place, and that they've gone through some of the analysis that's already needed to evaluate at least the 193 Beekman property from a development standpoint.
So, David, who would the developer be interfacing with on behalf of the village?
Would be with your board.
So, that goes back to Glenn's original point. If there was bullet points of attractive or, maybe items that would benefit a developer in their interest of a property, I think that would be almost pre-packaging something, but not specifically, but just, having some bullet points saying, maybe reduce parking requirements, or, a rooftop bar or something like that, just in terms of, having a benchmark for a developer.
Okay.
Because,
I think
I mean,
that's the idea.
Yeah.
Both of those elements have been floated for 193 Beekman, and for really obvious reasons.
right.
And I still go back to, like, this is our test project. Let's see how this works as we go through it. And I think signaling to the development community by adopting this floating zone is that we can be flexible. We intend to be flexible.
Right.
We intend to try to maximize the potential for certain sites in the village. could send a strong signal to the development community. I know I personally have met with 5 or 6, at least 5 different development teams that are interested in 193 Beekman. And I've said the same thing to each one of them. Here's the elements, here's what we got. And the village board is considering a floating zone, which might change some of these pieces. And it's like, oh, okay. Well, when you do that, we'd be interested in moving forward. And so, I mean, there's a lot of interest on
I guess
that.
the only thing I would anticipate, a developer's gonna come in like any other developer and want a bunch of stuff that they want, absolutely no affordable housing or 0 parking requirements. So we have to maybe have a benchmark for them on a particular property,
Yeah.
just as expectations would be,
Right.
put out there.
Yeah, no, I understand. And I think the way the language is crafted, the village has a lot of leverage
Sure.
over and discretion as to whether
Right.
the floating zone gets applied to a particular piece of property.
Right.
So a developer interest would need to understand that the village is the one who is granting the waivers, if you will, or the development program with the incentives. And so they have to be able to work with the community in order to make a project work.
Mhm.
Any additional comments from the public on either one of the public hearing topics? Any additional comments from the board or questions for Mr. Smith?
I just wanted to make a comment about the sidewalk policy, because this came about because our busiest season is October 1st, for tourism. And, I think several restaurateurs came to us and requested that this be possibly extended. If it ends October 1st, it really does nothing for them as far as outdoor seating on a 75-degree day on October 15th. So that's where this comes from. It would be weather permitting like tonight, you would never sit outside a restaurant. So I don't think it would be 6 months of additional outdoor seating. There wouldn't be any tents put up or anything like that. I understand it not to be tents and heaters, but it's a good point, because, I think we need to specify what the outdoor cafe seating would be, But that's where this came from. I think we just broadened it to all year round, because the language was just easier to pull back on than, expand it out, so.
And I think there's room for compromise. I mean, if instead of all year round, it's been suggested it's, until the end of October, until the end of November, something along those lines. I mean, whether or not that makes a real difference when you get into December, January, February, when people are not going to be outside anyway, but
Yeah.
something to consider.
I would agree with that. I think what we typically do with these kinds of situations is we go big first, and then we tighten it up as it makes sense. And I don't think anybody is advocating for outdoor seating outside of restaurants in December and January. But through the month of October, it does make sense, especially if the weather's nice. And sometimes it's even nice around Thanksgiving. So there could be events where it makes sense.
And in March.
And March too. But the idea that we would have this available 365 days a year is not the intent.
Well, I wanted my snow cone on January 4th outside in Beekman.
Go to Lennox.
What's your pleasure, folks? Hold them both, adjourn both public hearings, at least until next week?
Yes.
Certainly on the floating zone, we need to do, I would expect that we need to keep it open while we wait for our comments back from the county and from the planning board. Certainly, we would like to move forward on 193 Beekman, but we need that, so we should be holding it open for a few weeks at least. And we're unlikely to change the outdoor seating certainly in this month or in the next one. So I think holding the public hearing open for a while is not going to hurt anything on that. So can I get a motion to adjourn both public hearings?
So moved.
Seconded.
Denise on the second, trustee Scaglione on the second. Moved and seconded, all in favor say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Opposed or abstentions? All right, the public hearings are adjourned until, that motion was adjourning them until Tuesday next week, which is December 10th, on or around 7 p.m. Just a quick reminder, since talking about next week is a board meeting. And then again, we have a board meeting on December 17th. And we will not have a board meeting or not have a meeting at all on the 24th of December or the 31st of December. So next two will be board meetings. All right, we're going to move on to our work session items. Our first item is discussion, presentation about the LoSAP program. And we've got a couple of gentlemen who are going to explain exactly what that means and what some options are. And while you're getting ready, I just want to thank you again, Mr. Smith, for your input. Welcome to Sleepy Hollow, gentlemen.
Thank you. Good evening.
And as you heard me earlier, yeah, use the
Trying
microphones.
to get close to the mic. Is that okay?
We have a stunningly large viewing audience, so.
Well, good evening. My name is Robert or Bob Sagastano. This is Vincent Pulio. We are both from, our agency is entitled the Hometown Firefighter and EMS Services Agency. We're part of a larger insurance agency that does the complete line of property casualty, any type of insurance our agency writes. In addition to that, one of our divisions is AMAC, the Association of Mature American Citizens, and that is essentially like an ARP type of an organization with over 2 million members, I believe, is the current census. We have had an opportunity to make a presentation to Anthony, as well as a gentleman by the name of, I believe, the captain in the fire service, Larry Lee, a couple of weeks back, I guess. And so what we thought we would do tonight, if it pleases you, is to just give you a little bit of overview about what these LoSAP programs are all about, and explain that to a certain degree, decisions have to be made as to certain variables or elements of the program as to how you really want to structure it. And then, of course, once that's done, there's a whole point system and so forth that has to be decided upon. And much of that is done in concert with the fire department itself, okay? So let me is that acceptable to you to approach it that way? Okay. And you can stop me at any point. So if you will, I gave you a handout. This is exactly what we went over previously with Anthony and Captain Lee. And basically describing LoSAPs LoSAP programs, or length of service award programs, are similar to, but not exactly like pension programs. So they don't fall under any of the federal guidelines for ERISA or anything like that. They are state approved, part of the general municipal law, but they act similar to a pension program. And basically their purpose is to recruit and retain volunteers in either the fire or EMS agencies. Given the fact that last figure that we've had is about 86% of the country is actually protected by volunteer organizations, firefighters and so on, it's increasingly important for the various fire jurisdictions, fire protections, villages, fire districts and so forth to try to recruit, and once they have them on board and have trained them, retain members and have them continue to respond to alarms. As you're probably aware, the current situation with the fire service is the number of alarms has increased significantly. because of the, mainly because of the impact of EMS. So I know certain places, fire districts or fire departments just respond to fire alarms, maybe motor vehicle accidents, and then another group of individuals handles the emergency medical services, but in many places, it's a combined response. So the idea, of course, is that the number of calls is significantly increasing as we go forward, in some cases because of an aging population and for other reasons. So what the state did back in the late 80s, early 90s, is they passed legislation. It's part of the general municipal law that allowed for jurisdictions to actually go out to referendum. I believe you have to. I'm not certain about all the village laws, so forgive me if I misstate something in that regard. But basically allowed you to go out for a referendum and receive approval to spend taxpayer dollars on these length of service award programs. Typically, and I'll keep this high level, but typically it requires 60% of the governing board, I guess in this case it would be 60% of the trustees, to approve it, and then it would have to go out to a public referendum, and the public would vote on it and either approve it or reject it. So I would suggest to you that a significant number, very significant number, I don't know the exact percentage, of fire departments, fire districts, village fire departments and so forth have had these programs in place for coming up on 30 years now. So they have been around for a long time. Our organization does over 200, I think the number is 225 currently, different LoSAP programs as part of our firefighter division. Sometimes I know there's a lot of confusion about the general municipal laws, so if you will, the next page, the one that says laws of the state of New York, just by virtue of understanding it a bit, the general provisions that outline the LoSAP programs are contained in Article 11-A, sections 214 through 219A. That was the original legislation that was passed to provide for these LoSAP programs. Shortly thereafter, and it was only strictly volunteer fire departments, not EMS agencies. The EMS agencies kind of raised some hell about it and said, this is not fair. Why should the firefighters who are volunteering just get these programs and not EMS? So if you look, Section 11AA has to do with only ambulance agencies, and it talks about defined contribution. I'll get into that in a moment. And then Section 11AAA is defined benefits, again, only for ambulance corps. The conditions and the laws are very similar. I would suggest that the largest variance comes in terms of the points that are required to make the credit for a firefighter or an EMS person to gain credit for a particular year. So some of the things that apply to the ambulance corps, for example, don't apply to the fire departments, okay? So that's the main difference, and we'll talk about that a little bit further. What happened was, after the program came into being, within a few years, in the program, when you have to establish an entitlement age. So let's say the entitlement age for the start to collect benefits is 60 years old. What happened was a gentleman, actually it was the Centerport Fire Department on Long Island, filed a complaint with the federal government and said, the fact that I can only collect up to and gain benefits up to the point of entitlement is basically unfair. I'm over 60 years old. I've been in the fire service for 40 years or whatever it was. And he said, I'm still responding to alarms. And he had a good point, quite frankly. And why shouldn't I be able to increase the benefit that I'm allotted each month since I'm still responding and still active? The federal government agreed with him and said this is age discrimination. Typically in a pension, if any of you are retired, you know once you reach retirement age, whatever your benefits are, they essentially are frozen at that point. You may have some kind of a cost of living benefit or something, but essentially you don't get additional credit once you retire. That's the way these programs were structured. But the federal government said, we really don't care what the state believes to be accurate. This is age discrimination, and an EEOC complaint was filed, and they said to the various authorities having jurisdiction, fire districts, fire protection, villages, and so forth, you can't do this. You have to allow this gentleman and others like him to collect benefits, what's called post-entitlement, or is what has become known as LoSAP Part 2, all right? That's what this Article 11 quadruple A speaks to, and it allows, the laws were amended the general municipal law was amended to allow for what's called post-entitlement, and that's something that we'll talk about in a little bit further. Okay, there are two types of LoSAP programs that exist. There's something called a defined contribution. Basically, what the sponsor, that would be you, would do would be decide a figure between $300 and $720 per year to be credited for each firefighter who makes their points. Now, I would tell you, just 2 weeks ago, this was amended to $1,200. So forgive me, I didn't realize I hadn't corrected it in the PowerPoint. So you can do anywhere between $300 and $1,200 per year is credited to a firefighter with a maximum years of service of 40 years. And this tends to be the least expensive of the two programs, all right, because it's a fixed amount of money that you decide upon. The money is put into a particular firefighter's name. We invest the money. They earn benefits from the investments. They earn benefits from the interest and so forth. And at the end of each year, their dollar amount is changed to reflect whatever the benefit of those investments and contributions are.
I'm sorry, once we select an amount, can that be changed from year to year?
Yes.
It can.
The only thing, anything changes that you make to your original public referendum that cost money, you have to go back out to referendum. So it's not the type of thing that you want to do very often, because
Right, so
there
this
are-
is part of the referendum, the amount we choose?
yes,
Okay.
yeah, all right. The alternative type is what's called a defined benefit program. This is the most common. I would suggest to you it's probably in about 90% of the LoSAP programs that we write, maybe even higher. And in that case, the sponsor commits to somewhere between $5 a month of credit, a year of credit, to $30. So let's say a firefighter had 5 years or 10 years, make the math simple, and you decided to do $10 for every year of credit. When that person reached entitlement age, they would be entitled to $100 payment each month once they reached entitlement. All right? Generally speaking, most fire departments are in the range of around 20 to 30. That's typically the range that we have most of our districts and protection zones and so forth in. The state law allows up to a maximum of 40 years of credit, and we are now at the point where we've been in this program about 30 years, and you'll hear me speak to something called a buyback, so it's actually 35 years. So we're starting to get to the point now where some firefighters in places where they started this program early in the 1990s are reaching the maximum benefit of 40 years times whatever monthly amount has been put through in their referendum. Okay? This increase to $1,200 per month maximum payment is the result of those districts that had established a younger entitlement age. The youngest you can do is 55, and a high amount per month, which would be 30. So you can see you're starting to, if you start to get to the point where you're 35 years, you're going to start capping out. And in many cases, an individual firefighter will reach the maximum payment. Up until a couple of weeks ago, it was $800 a month. Now it's been increased to 12. Okay? So those are the two different types of programs. Eligibility, the state law indicates that the individual has to be 18 years of age and has to have completed 1 year of service. So once they reach those two criteria, they are basically in the program. And then from that point on, they have to make actually even that year, they have to make their points and so forth, which we'll talk about in a moment. The points...
One quick question.
Sure.
Is that state law, or could you decide, you have to be in service for 3 years before you would be eligible?
No,
Vested.
that's the general municipal law. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, you can't, certain aspects of this, you really don't have any flexibility. Most of the time, you have a range of flexibility, things that you make a decision on certain variables, which we would guide you through, okay? We can get into a much greater, as a matter of fact, the last couple of slides go into, and I gave those for the benefit of the fire service themselves, because they have to establish and you have to approve a set of points. So there's great detail at the end of this program about the points, but generally speaking, points are earned by going to department responses, meaning responding to fire alarms, training sessions, drills, meetings, standbys, and any other miscellaneous activities, parades, and so forth, okay? And it's basically what the law does is it establishes the maximum number of points that can be allotted, with the exception of the alarms. The alarms are 25 points out of the 50 that a firefighter needs. You can't change the 25. You can make it more difficult. So let's say a particular thing, let's say training is a maximum of 20 points. The sponsor can say, we're only going to give 10 points for training. By and large, most sponsors have not made these things so strict that people don't make them, because then you lose the benefit of the whole purpose of the program. So the sponsor can select, on the next page, what activities they want to award points for, but the general municipal law sets the maximum number of points. Volunteers earning 50 points a year are credited with 1 year of service. And annually, the fire company and the department is required to submit a list to the sponsoring district of all members who have reached 50 points. So typically what happens is the chief's office will send to you a list of the firefighters who, a census we call it, who have met the requirements of the 50 points for that particular year. Once they identify that, and it's given to you, they have to post it at the firehouse or some public place and allow anybody, any firefighters who disagree. So let's assume for a moment my name is posted and it says 49 points. And I say, wait a minute, I did more than that. I have a month, basically, 30 days to basically bring to the attention of the fire authorities the fact that I disagree with the points, and then they can investigate it and look into it. By and large, the sponsor, yourselves, would not be too involved in that process because it really requires monitoring of, I believe these folks have Red Alert, which is a system that keeps track of alarms and so forth. It has the ability to keep track of these LoSAP points. So typically, you're really going to be working off the chief's authorization and signature and verification saying that this represents the accurate list. I mean, you could always challenge it, I guess, but usually it's not something that you have to do other than eventually approve it. And it's just a matter of a resolution saying we're accepting this census from the fire department. You're going to see I use the term Board of Fire Commissioners because in many cases that's what these are, fire districts, but the sponsor also, as I said, has to certify it. So you would need a board resolution at some point saying we agree that these, 25 individuals met the criteria for the 50 points. After that, the census is sent to us. We forward it on to an actuary who then does the calculations to determine how much money has to be put into the program to adequately fund it and so forth. And that's at the end of, during each year at some point, depending on how quickly we get the census and get it up to the actuary. Obviously, all the departments are submitting it right around the beginning of the year, so the first few months, there's a little bit of a lag in getting the reports from the actuary, but then it kind of opens up a bit. But what we typically do is meet with you at least once a year, more often if you'd like, and we would go over this detailed actuarial report with you, going over, the number of members, the census, active members, inactive members, and so forth, and the cost of the program and where your investments are and so on. The next page speaks to vesting. Vesting basically is if you have less than 5 years, you are not vested in the program. If you have more than 5 years, you're vested 100%. So what that means is if a firefighter, let's say assume the firefighter has done 7 years of service to Sleepy Hollow and then decides to move to California or something, that individual is vested in the program. His benefits are not going to increase other than the fact that, but when he reaches entitlement age, let's say you decide on 60 years old, at that point, we will start to make payments to him, or you will start to make payments to him. Okay? Let's see. Also, there's some stipulations that say, members are vested upon reaching entitlement age, death, or being disabled. The law speaks to disablement, particularly line of duty disablement, and at that point, benefits are started. So once you're vested, any of those factors, either reaching entitlement age, becoming deceased where your beneficiary would receive the benefits, and or being disabled, you start to collect immediately.
Goes to your point, you have to spend 5 years in the fire department to get vested. So if you're in for 4.5 years and you leave the fire department, that money stays within the plan and he's not vested.
Yeah, that's a good point.
So it's it's something that you were bringing up.
So any of your members who don't reach that 5-year point, whatever funds we've put away for, firefighter John Smith, they stay within your overall assets, and they're not going to ever be collected because he didn't vest. Now, typically, And this is, again, a decision you have to make, but I would suggest that 99% of the organizations say that if that gentleman comes back, let's say he did 4 years, and now he moves away to go to college or something and comes back and wants to join again, most locations, most sponsors will say, all right, we're going to start him off at 4 years, and then if he makes his 5th year, then he's vested.
Who manages the funds in the plan?
Usually, what happens typically is we do all the services. We do the administration, which is, maintaining all these census sheets and so forth. Depending on how we approach this, we issue all the checks through a bank. The actuarial report is done by a vendor that we hire, and then the investments are usually done through us, not necessarily by us, but through us. So we offer, for example, and I don't know the rules about villages, so forgive me, but if this were a fire district, and this was taxpayer funds that are received from a town, let's say, the taxpayer funds that are received to run the regular fire service bills and so forth and costs have to be placed in banks. That's what the law says as far as that goes. Now, the problem with that, of course, is in past years, I've been a commissioner myself in a fire district, so we put the money in the bank, and it has to be secured and so forth by the bank, but that's all we could invest in. That's what the law says. Now, in the past, when the interest rates were decent, we were doing okay. Now, I assume you're in the same boat we are in. We're not making any money on interest anymore, so that's hurt us across the board, all across the state. What's good about the general municipal law is this is different. This allows you to do investments of different types. So you can buy stocks if you wanted to. We do a lot of annuities. Most of our districts and villages have taken a very, very conservative approach, and I dare say most of them have never lost a penny because they've put the money into investments that are secure, most of the time fixed, but some of them have invested in equities, and we have the personnel that can do that. But most of them are risk opposed, so to speak, and have taken a very conservative approach on the investments.
So New York State plays no role?
No role. Other than to
Completely
control.
up to the village?
Yes. Yeah, there are two factors in the investment arena. There's something in the general municipal law that speaks to the prudent man rule, and basically that concept is, if this were your money, would you invest it in something? And more importantly, the laws of 1940, which basically established like securities and so forth, they govern what type of investments. So, for example, we use a lot of life insurance investments, annuities. Some of them are fixed investments, meaning you earn a certain amount of money for a 5, 7, 10-year period, and then the annuity matures, and you can renew it at whatever the current rate is. Those are controlled by life insurance companies. So those are completely safe. There's something called the Life Guarantee Corp, which controls failures in the life insurance industry. And I would tell you that, to your point about the state, New York State has probably the strictest rules on life insurance companies, reserves and so forth that are required in the country. It makes it somewhat difficult for a number of life insurance companies to even do business here. But the ones that do business in here, establishing high reserve, and these are very safe investments.
But the funds are not insured.
Well, if they are, again, insured to a certain safe, I would suggest to you, conservatively safe. For example, if you were to go into a group annuity, you have the Life Guarantee Corp covers up to $1 million worth of coverage. So if the particular insurance company that you are dealing with goes bankrupt, all the rest of the insurance companies in the state of New York have to meet the obligations of that carrier. If you do an individual annuity, which is what we do a lot of, those are limited to $500,000. So there's different types of coverages and support, or it's almost like the FDIC, essentially. There's a certain thresholds that you're protected for.
So
the
Glenn,
federal, excuse me, just one
what,
last question.
no, what I was going to suggest is that we have an offline conversation about how to invest that, because it is very complicated, and you have to make some decisions about, are you going to go with a defined benefit, or are you going to go with a DC, which is basically a defined contribution, which would mean that we would be giving the individual the money to invest. So there's a lot of different investment options, and it's kind of complicated, but,
So it's different than a pension here?
Yes.
Oh,
Yes.
because
Now,
many
but what
pensions
happens
are
basically
insured.
is, we have, I would even the guess is probably somewhere around $500 million or something like that, you know, there's invested for all these fire districts that we deal, and fire departments that we deal with. What we do essentially is, if you were to come on board, what we would do is we would establish a trust in a bank, because it has to be in a bank. There is $0 in our name as far as the agency. This is your money in your name. And then depending upon what investments, again, those are all in your name. So typically, the owner of the investment would be the village. The beneficiary of the investment, if it's an annuity, would be the village. And then because annuities require a live person, we would identify probably one of you as the annuitant. But that's the way it is. This money is really not in any of your firefighters' names. It's in a general trust for the firefighters. And
Controlled by you.
Controlled by you.
We,
And
the board.
and you have, the report that we give you annually, the report that we give you annually would identify how much money has been accrued by firefighter A, B, C, and D, but it's not their money. It's the village's money and assets that have to ultimately be paid to them. Okay?
Thank you.
Okay, let's see, so benefits will start on the next page. When do benefits begin? Basically, benefits begin when the member reaches entitlement age, and that can be anywhere between 55 and 65 years of age. You have to make a decision on that. You folks will make the decision on what type of entitlement age is determined, and you can change it. But to your point, anything that you want to change, if it's potentially cost you more money, it has to go to public referendum. So if you wanted to start off at, let's say, 60, and at some point reduce it to 55 down the road, that's done all the time. We do go, these sponsors do go out for a change.
I just have a quick question.
Yes, sir.
Can somebody still be inactive and collect?
Yes.
Okay, so,
Yeah, that's the result of that EEOC complaint.
right.
So that individual who's, let's say, 62 years old, and you have an entitlement age of 60, if
Right.
he's still responding or she's still responding to alarms, makes the 50 points, then they would collect that post-entitlement or Part 2. And there's a number of ways of handling that. Okay?
See, instead of reinventing the plan all over again after the EEOC complaint,
Right.
they just said, look, we'll have post-entitlement. We'll keep everything in place that we originally made arrangements for, but now we'll give the firefighter the option to be able to collect another 50 points for another
Sure.
entitlement.
Okay, the next page speaks to tax considerations, and again, this PowerPoint is geared for sometimes being presented to fire service members also. So in a nutshell, these funds that we pay out, we issue 1099s at the end of the year, that's part of our responsibility, and they are subject to federal taxation. They are subject to state taxation. However, the governor did sign a bill that at 59.5, if the firefighter selects a monthly option where they're being paid on a monthly basis once they reach entitlement, after 59.5, you don't pay state tax on it anymore. Okay? Plan options. There's a couple of different ways to approach this. If you decided on either one of the programs, either the defined contribution or the defined benefit, you can do a couple of different things. You can have a series of options that a firefighter can select from. Typically, they're based on the actuarial calculation of life with 10-year certain, which means the firefighter is going to get paid, or their beneficiaries, someone's going to get paid for 10 years of payments, of benefits. However, let's say you decide on 60 years old as your entitlement age, and we decide on life with 10-year certain as the criteria, that firefighter or his beneficiary is going to collect from 60 to 70, but if he lives to 90, he's going to continue to collect, all right? The other alternative is to offer him different payment options. From an actuarial standpoint, they're all equal. So the actuary would come back with figures that said if they wanted to, let's say, select a survivor benefit where we're going to pay to the life of the firefighter and up to the death of his spouse, that's going to be a lesser amount per month than if he were to take, let's say, a 5-year fixed plan where he's going to get the money quicker, or the lump sum. I'm not even going to suggest to simplify the process. A lot of our districts and divisions simply take the life with 10-year certain, whereby the individuals start receiving benefits at a certain entitlement age. They're guaranteed to be paid for life, but we also guarantee that someone's going to get paid for 10 years. Okay?
And that's all done by life expectancy compounded money. That's how the actuaries figure it out.
The next thing, other benefits, we talk about if you die before entitlement age, your beneficiary will receive a minimum death benefit or the value of the earned or what's called the accrued value of past service, whichever is greater rather. This is not limited to fire service-related death, can be triggered by any death or cause. What we suggest, typically what we do in these programs is we build a life insurance component in, and then the decision has to be made by you folks. In some locations, they say, all right, and I'm just making up a number now, we're going to supply a $10,000 death benefit. And if the firefighter dies before entitlement age, that firefighter will receive either the larger of the two, whatever they've accrued in benefit, or the $10,000. What this does is it protects some of the younger members who have, let's say a person started at 20 years old, and he's been in for, I don't know, 10 years, he's 30 years old now, and I'm going to make up numbers now. His accrued benefit is $8,000, let's say, all right? In order to provide some minimum benefit, God forbid he were to pass before reaching age 60, the life insurance component would kick in, and we would pay him the larger of the two. On the other hand, if it's an individual that's been around for a long time, maybe 30 or 40 years, his accrued benefit is going to be significantly higher than the $10,000. So you have two options there. He can get the higher amount, and in some places the death benefit term insurance continues after entitlement, or in some places you can stop it at the entitlement age. And all of those picks, so to speak, or variables or components of your program is what we would walk you through, I guess, in conjunction with the fire department.
Yeah, and that's all subject to various premiums.
Yes.
Right.
Yeah. What Anthony authorized us to do, and I don't have it for tonight because we wanted to wait for his authorization, was to just come up with a general, if we accepted certain criteria, come up with some ideas as to what it's going to cost.
Yeah.
Okay? So just on that point, what we elected to do was we spoke about, I'm having the actuary run two numbers, $20 a month defined benefit and $25 a month defined benefit. You're not going to have any accrued liability other than if you allow for what's called a 5-year buyback. Most of the general municipal law allows for a 5-year buyback. So let's say you had an individual who was in the fire service for 30 years, and he's getting close to entitlement, or maybe even after entitlement, and now you put this program into place. In my case, I was allowed to get 5 years of service. I gave up 20-some-odd years because I was in for a long time. I've been in for a long time. But when my district started the program, they allowed us a 5-year buyback. What that does is it minimizes your accrued liability because otherwise it gets too expensive to start these programs. Now, I don't honestly know how many members are over whatever your entitlement age. The other thing we agreed to with Larry actually was, and just, again, it's just a start point, $20 a month, $25 a month, two prices, allowing for the 5-year buyback, which is very normal. We use 60 as a start point, and again, this can be changed. It's going to, the cost will be different if we change the variable. And the other thing is to put the post-entitlement in, meaning allowing a guy after entitlement age to collect. So the actuary will project out those numbers out, okay? And so I'll have an actuarial sample for you that'll give you some idea of what the program's going to cost. Now, if you were to start the program, and I'm just going to say for the sake of discussion, I understand you go out to referendum in March. Let's say you were to start the program. You can probably start the program with an effective point system as of January 1, 2020, or you could do 2021, whatever. The only thing that you would really owe in accrued benefits, so to speak, or money that you owe them for past service would be the 5-year buyback. Other than that, you're going to have a very limited accrued benefit, and then it's going to be going forward. You're going to start to build up the liability. Okay? The next page with the firefighters is a very important lesson. Again, this is made for the firefighters. It's very, very important that we maintain a very accurate beneficiary forms, because once these folks reach entitlement, or God forbid they pass, and they've got, an ex-wife or a deceased parent or something like that, it becomes obviously very problematic for the firefighters and for us and for you to try to figure out, what we do with these funds. And the last thing you want to happen is they just go into some kind of a state fund or something like that, and nobody ever collects them. Okay?
So every single year, we would get that report, we'd come up here, we'd present it to you, we'd remind you and have extra beneficiary forms there. And, you know, we suggest that, you know, you ask the chief at your department meetings, at least once or twice a year, to say, if you guys have changed beneficiaries, please, if you guys have changed your beneficiaries, please fill this out so that there are no problems. So we try to keep you up to date on that.
Generally speaking, those are maintained by the fire department itself. We can maintain them. If you want to send us a copy, we can certainly maintain a list, but it's probably best because of the, you know, continuous changes in life situations for these firefighters. Let me just talk very, very quickly about the point system. This is one of the areas that the state gets pretty tough with, and when they come in for an audit, this is one of the areas that they look at most stringently. So, in a nutshell, you have, in this case, I understand your EMS services are a separate organization, so the firefighters here for response to alarms can get up to 25 points. The number of points required, the number of alarms response required is based on that chart that's on the next page. So I don't know, let's assume for a moment that there are 500 to 1,000 calls. The state requires a response to 7.5%, or someplace in the range of 37 to 75, depending upon what the final number is. And then it decreases as you get into fire departments that are over 1,500 calls a year. You're down to basically needing 2.5% of the alarms. All right, so you cannot change that. It's 25 points for alarms, that's fixed. That's about the only thing that is fixed. And then running through it very quickly, training courses can be up to 25 points, and there is it describes some, you know, details on that. Drills, up to 20 points maximum, and usually it's 1 point for a drill, usually it requires a 2-hour minimum drill. So if the chief has got, if they're out doing some kind of practice or something like that, or he's doing a training session in the firehouse, that would be a drill. He can identify that as a drill. Sleep-ins or standbys, it gets a little bit technical there, but in the event, for example, that we get a very bad snowstorm, most of the time we're in the firehouse overnight or for 2 days or whatever, so that we can have a rapid response, and there's points that are allowed for that, up to 20 points. Anytime he calls for sleep-in or standbys, that's authorized.
I have a quick question.
Yes, sir.
We usually pay them. Does it matter? We pay the people on standby.
Not very much.
We don't pay much, but.
Yeah, I mean, technically, you're not supposed to double dip, so to speak. You're not supposed to.
And we also have a limit on the number of people that will pay per firehouse, so you could have, which it's been 4, I think. So you could have 6 people there.
I don't think anybody would be, if it's minimal amount, I don't think there'd be any issue with the state on that. And it happens so infrequently. I mean, unless you're not doing, like EMS agency sometimes will have, you sign up for between, I don't know, let's say 6 p.m. and midnight on a Saturday or something. Is that what you're doing, or?
No,
We don't do that.
snow
Just when
emergencies.
bad snowstorms and ice storms and hurricanes
Yeah.
or things like that?
Yeah.
I don't think that would be.
I would say use your best judgment.
So, if I could just make one point, in the fire service, they like to call it resting, not sleeping.
Okay, I'll go along with that. All right, the next thing is meetings, again, up to 20 points. This has to be an official meeting that's called by the chief, and it can be a meeting of, of the Board of Trustees or something like that, or any type of a meeting that the chief is authorizing. That's the whole key. He has to be authorizing the meeting to occur, and they can get up to 20 points. Then you got miscellaneous things like you can do parades and things like that. Any other points that you want to, inspections, anything that the chief and you folks agree to. Again, as long as it doesn't exceed 15 points, you're fine. Parades. Disability. It's 5 points a month for certain line of duty disabilities. If the person is totally and temporarily disabled by a workers' comp board certification and/or another competent authority that you folks accept, that he's, let's say a guy broke his leg or something, and clearly he can't respond anymore, and his own doctor is the one that's certifying he broke his leg, you can accept that. You don't need to get a comp authorization, as long as it's someone that meets your qualifications as a competent authority. So especially when they're in the line of duty, you don't want these guys to not get credit for that, all right? Teaching a fire prevention course, military service, you're allowed to allow for 1 4-year voluntary tour of duty in the military, which means you give that individual, let's say he's in the fire department, now he joins the military, he's enlisted for 4 years in the Army or Navy or something like that, you're allowed to give him the 50 points, grant the 50 points each year for a 4-year period. If he was in the National Guard and he got activated, and he's activated for 6 months, you give him 5 points a month up to, for the 6-month period that he's activated. And the only thing that causes forfeiture of these benefits, and it's total forfeiture, is a conviction of arson. Okay? So that's the overview of the program. Let me stop there for 2 minutes, and I'm almost done, so I don't want to take up a lot of your time. Can I answer any questions about the program itself, or programs?
Yeah, programs. So we have some exceptional folks who are both members of our volunteer ambulance corps and one of our fire companies. If we adopted a plan for the fire companies and a plan for the ambulance corps, would those individuals be eligible on both programs, assuming they got 50 points in both?
If they are, my answer would be, if they're separate organizations, I would say yes.
They are separate organizations.
Yeah, I mean, in a lot of places, the fire service does the EMS calls. Sometimes it's a separate squad and so forth, or a separate group of EMTs, but if you got 2 separate organizations, that person, if he were volunteering, and you have to make his points in both, and then he would be eligible.
Ours is separate because we do revenue recovery for the ambulance corps.
Okay.
So,
And
Now,
let's say-
let me ask you, I know there was some discussion about the possibility of you wanting the EMS folks to have this benefit also, which I suspect is gonna, would be an issue if the fire service got it and the EMS folks didn't. Are those folks tax-supported, the EMS folks?
yes.
They are. Okay, so then you need a referendum for them too, separate referendum. Or maybe not a separate referendum. I don't know that, the lawyer would have to help you on that. You might be able to do one referendum for 2 organizations, I don't know.
I just have one more question, Bob.
Yes, sir.
Is it Bob?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
So just, if a person has a beneficiary for 20 years.
Yep.
They get divorced, marry, again, and would that original beneficiary be entitled to the payouts once he came of age, or?
No, the firefighter, if he were still alive, would get the benefit.
Right.
But if he, let's say
passed away, let's say.
then unfortunately,
The 10-year certain.
it's gonna be whoever's on the beneficiary form.
So he could change his beneficiary the last day and
Oh,
it
yeah.
would be that
Yeah,
person.
that
I
can
guess
be-
they would legally have to
It can be
sue.
updated at any point.
Yeah.
Right.
It's not a conventional retirement
Right,
system, so yeah, you could change it anytime you want.
Yeah, it's also what the spouse negotiates with that individual, right? So they say, hey, yeah, we're getting divorced, but I want 50%.
That's not true.
No?
No,
This is your
The
your
firefighter's
plan.
plan.
So that's it, you can't,
The only negotiations between you and the attorney. The courts will not mandate
Right.
that the spouse gets half, a third, or anything.
Now, they can, the spouse may end up being entitled to half of the benefit. You're correct in that regard.
right.
The only thing is, we, as the administrator, cannot pay anyone that money as a
Who's
result
not on
of a
the
divorce.
beneficiary, right?
Yeah, so if, let's say, I'm going to make up a number, let's say the guy was entitled to $200 a month, and he gets divorced, and they agree on a 50-50 split, he's going to have to pay the wife $100 from some other source,
Yeah.
because this money, the law does not allow us to.
Goes to him.
Correct,
Right.
yeah.
So
Or her.
us, as the payee, they can't mandate us to pay her direct.
I got you.
So some of our most active volunteers are also employees of the village and are pension eligible. Would they also qualify for this?
Yes,
Good.
yeah, if they're volunteer firemen, yeah.
It's actually a non-qualified plan. It's not part of the
Just
pension
want to make
system.
sure.
So
Right.
I have another question related to that. We have several that are police officers, for example. They would respond to a fire while they were working as a police officer. Now, that would almost be a negative for them because they wouldn't get credit for that. I mean,
That's correct.
is there something that we could do to build points in for a police officer who's working who responded to that incident or emergency.
Is on duty, you mean?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I don't think they,
I don't want it to it almost works against them, being a
Yeah,
volunteer
the-
police officer.
we should talk about that with the
Yeah.
chief and the chiefs, because, I don't think a police officer has a choice when they're on duty.
They don't have a choice, but
I mean,
my
they
question
can't-
is, in order to benefit that individual, I would almost opt for, I would give them the point for that, incident, because they are responding in some capacity.
I would suggest to you my best answer, and I could research this a little bit more. There was a point in time when these laws first came out, they said that, let's say you had a maintenance man, a house man, they call him, that's in the firehouse. He could even be maybe an EMT that does both cleanup and responds on alarms, let's say. Originally, they said that individual could not be paid by the sponsor or fire district, and then also receive points. That was later changed. But I don't think, and again, I'm not 100% on this one, I don't believe that you could do that with a active and on-duty police officer. If you had a in-house maintenance man, let's say, or someone working for the fire district, a dispatcher or something like that, and you really had a bad alarm and you wanted that individual to go out, that person could then qualify for the points.
So our ambulance corps is paid, we have one individual who's paid 12 hours a day, 7 days a week. They're not volunteers.
Right.
Would they be separate from this system?
They would not be eligible for this program.
Okay.
No, yeah, they have to be volunteers.
That's correct, yeah, that's exactly it.
I have one question, kind of relates to what Glenn was talking about, but in terms of the you said that by state law, the money has to go to a bank,
No, I
or
was.
be in trusts.
I was referring to your regular tax dollars. I believe if you folks get tax dollars in, and I don't know what's the next level up? Are they village taxes, or they come from a town? I don't know the structure here.
Village.
All right, so those funds, I believe, and I'm not 100% sure of this, I believe the only place you can put those funds in terms of maintaining them is in a regular bank, a commercial bank, and that those funds have to be secured by that bank. That's typically what happens in a fire district. So that's the point I was making. Now, what I said to you was, there's no, again, I don't know if this is absolutely correct, but I don't think the village can go out and buy stocks and invest in stocks.
No, I mean, but the village could engage with a brokerage firm or a company that manages pension plans.
Okay, yeah,
you know,
I guess you could.
To manage those investments on behalf of those people who we're paying into. is
Oh,
what
you're
I'm
talking
saying.
about, could you hire a third party to invest
Yeah.
do your investments? Yes, yeah, you can.
So it's, okay,
Yeah.
that's
But all
all.
I'm saying to you is what will typically happen, though, is you have to establish it, we would help you establish a trust or an adoption agreement. Typically, what we do is we have money put in the bank. You can either purchase an annuity when the individual reaches entitlement age, so now you're essentially absolving yourself of any interaction with firefighter John Smith. He reached entitlement age, he's entitled to a certain amount of money. We purchased an annuity, it's between the insurance company and him, and basically you folks are out of it. The benefit of that is, if he lives to 100, you're only paying up to what the actuarial analysis said he was going to live to. The alternative is, we can issue checks. We issue over $1.4 million a month in checks electronically. And then what we do, if we issue the checks then, is we establish that account. It's almost like an operational bank account with the bank. They issue the payments. We tell you how much you have to give us each year to pay your benefits, so to speak. I made the point, the money is in your name. If you were to do investments with us, everything is, again, we have investment counselors firms that work with us to do the investments, or we can do annuities, which are insurance products. But we establish basically what I refer to as a paper trail. So we don't do anything until we receive authorization from you to do it. So there's always going to be an authorization form signed that said, deposit this money into our bank account, or deposit or purchase an annuity with this money.
Can we invest that money the same way we do with the village, with very strict guidelines? In other words, the most conservative?
Yeah, I would suggest to you that, 97% of our the organizations that we do these LoSAP programs do very, very strict and conservative investments, and quite frankly, in most cases, have never lost a penny in the 30-some-odd years that we've been doing this. Now, at the other end of the spectrum, I don't want to mislead you. You know, if you were to go into the equity market in a good year, you might be making 15, 20% or something, all right, with a risk factor, all right? These investments, you're going to make 4% or something, but you're not going to ever lose a penny either, so.
Can you talk a little bit to the board about the DC plan, the difference between that and the defined benefit?
All right, so the defined contribution plan is a fixed amount of money that you elect to put aside for each firefighter who meets the 50-point criteria.
Right.
Typically, what happens is that money is then put in that firefighter's name, and whatever the results of the investments are, let's say, I don't know, you made 4% interest or something like that, 4% interest or is allotted in his name in the next report. And then if you made a contribution of another $700 or $1,000 in his name, it goes in his name in the report. This is only in a report. The money is still essentially in the general coffers of the village's program. It's just been allocated to a firefighter. The contribution, obviously, is going to be less money if you do a defined contribution, because it's going to be limited to whatever dollar amount you decide upon. The alternative is the defined benefit, and the defined benefit is you're agreeing to a certain amount of money per month for every year of service that the firefighter provides. So that one can go up as high, and again, it would take a long time, because you people are just starting the program, to get anywhere near $800 or $1,200 a month, the maximum. In other words, that would have to be like 40 years out from now, all right? So I don't see, in your case, because your firefighters haven't had this benefit, or EMS personnel have not had this benefit for the last 30-some-odd years that these programs have been available, what I suggested to Anthony was, I don't see it's going to be I don't think it would be a very costly, again, I don't know the finances of the village, but it would not be a tremendously costly program if you were to go with the defined benefit, which is the monthly amount. And we can do the projections. We can tell you how much it would be. Because your start point is going to be sometime in the future. So you really, right now, you go home zero unless you accept that 5-year buyback, which I recommend that you do.
So Bob, what do you need from the village in order to put these worksheets together? How many firefighters?
Well, I already have
ages?
that, actually.
Okay.
Captain Lee gave me a listing of all the firefighters, their dates of birth, and their time in service. So Anthony just approved it. We sent it up to the actuary to do kind of a sample for you,
Okay.
to give you an idea of what your accrued liability is. And like I said, it's going to be limited to just if you do the 5-year buyback, it's going to be limited to just that. And then your future liability, the actuary will tell you what she anticipates. Now, what she does typically is they'll do what I refer to as a worst-case scenario or most costly scenario. If you give us, just for the sake of discussion, a list of 100 names, she's going to assume that every one of those firefighters, whether they're 20 or 40 or 50 years old, is going to go to entitlement age of 60, perhaps, and stay on beyond that. So she's going to project them out to maybe 75 years old. And of course, if that's not the case, then it will change in the next report. And she'll say anybody who's post-entitlement, meaning after age 60, let's say 20 guys make their quotas that year, she's going to project those same 20 people to make it the following year. So it's always it's an actuarial study, so it's a fixed point in time with certain assumptions. And that's really what governs the cost of the thing, the assumptions.
See, members come and go. People who are entitled, they might make it 1 year, they might not make it the next year, but you have to put those actuarial numbers, that what if that be the case. So
Sure.
that's why we want to make sure that you're fully aware.
Now, what Anthony and I didn't bring enough copies. I didn't realize we have so many people. I'm sorry. What I did is I gave 2 additional copies of this. What's in here is, thank you. I gave you a sample of a planned document. Well, actually, I gave you a couple. The first page is next steps. I don't know if you want to maybe give a couple of these out.
Put one on each side.
Okay.
I have one of those already.
start one here. I kind of put, and this is not fixed, but I kind of put a listing together of what the next steps would be. So for example, we met once already with Anthony, we're meeting with you folks tonight. The department has asked us to come up and explain the whole LoSAP program to them. If you don't object to that, we'll certainly be willing to do that. We anticipate having to come up a number of times to help you along with the program. So there's kind of a listing next steps, so to speak, and you can look at those. They're not absolutely fixed. In other words, if you want us to come up and support you in a public response or a public hearing prior to the referendum, we'll make ourselves available to answer very specific questions to the public, you know, that type of thing. The next documents you have there are a sample document plan, and basically it amounts to a series of kind of checkoffs or decisions. So you have to decide, for example, what the entitlement age is going to be, 55, 60, 57, 62, 60, whatever you want. That'll govern the costs associated with it. Whether there's going to be a death benefit, all those types of things we're going to have to, if you want a 5-year buyback. I'm going to give you what is most typical, but then we can adjust it. Okay, so she's just going to run a sample just to give you an idea. And then lastly, I gave you a copy of the contract of what our responsibilities are on an annual basis. And I won't know an exact price until I see the actual report come back. And also, if you guys, how you decide to do the investments, that will change the pricing a little bit. But just to give you a rough idea, I mentioned we're probably in the range of about $3,500 to $4,000 a year for the actuarial report, which is the most expensive part, and then our administration. To set the whole program up, a one-time fee of $2,500, that's for us to come up with all these meetings. I have to pay the actuary for this sample that she's running. You're going to make changes to it, she's going to rerun it, so that type of stuff is kind of fixed costs. So we don't make a whole lot of money on that. It's more of a long-term relationship that we'd like to establish with you folks. So that's all there. I guess once this actuarial report comes in, I'll give it to you. Is that the idea? And you can take a look at it.
I'm good.
And we only have the dates of birth and the amount of years for the firefighters. We don't have anything for the ambulance people.
Yeah, that's a good point. If you think that you're going to do both, then I would need something about the ambulance corps. I don't know how many individuals are there and so forth.
Those numbers?
Is it, yeah, we'll work with that.
Yeah,
Is it 2,500 for each? Would it be the initial
Well,
setup?
I guess it depends on what, the answer is, if it's two different programs, yes, but we can probably work with you a little bit on that. It depends, if you allow us to come up, for example, if we're making a presentation to the fire department and you bring in the ambulance corps and it's all the same, you know, and they don't object to the two organizations, then, you know, we can cut back a little bit. We're not trying to hurt you in that regard, so.
I did want to mention one thing. If we go back 5 years or whatever it is, there's no real point system that they kept track of for those 5 years. So it would just apply to any active members.
That's a good point.
Regardless of whether they responded to 100 calls or one call.
Everybody would
they
get
were
the
active.
buyback.
Just have to do one solid year. You got to do that one solid year to get the 5 years back.
Okay.
In other words, what Anthony's saying is, and that's a very good point, by the way, you're not going to have, there's no points, nobody's been keeping track of, I mean, they may be, but they've not been keeping track of these 50 points backwards, all right? You're going to start, once you adopt the points, you're going to move forward with it. So if you do the 5-year buyback, basically it's any member of the organization that was a member for that 5-year period would get those 5 years of points automatically.
So Bob, I just have one more question. So if we start the program, you know, next summer, and somebody is of age, 65, let's say, and they're still active, would they start receiving a check?
If they had over 5 years in,
Right.
yes, they are
Yeah,
vested
if
in the
they've
program.
been volunteers for 30 years.
Yep.
Yeah.
But they still, since we're starting, wouldn't it be nobody gets anything until that first year is over with?
You could mandate that, yep. You could do that. Technically, they would be
I
available.
thought everybody has to get in 1 year under the point system.
Right, but that's, the general municipal law says that. But it also allows you for this 5-year buyback. So if you've got a person that's got 25 years in the fire service and has reached entitlement age, he's met that 1 year criteria already because
Right,
he's got
right.
5 years of
That's-
service. or
That's part of
25.
the question.
Oh, I thought
Yeah.
it was a separate,
But we also need to talk about
okay.
the point system, because we've already begun discussions with the fire service around how we wanted to sort of identify who actually provided the service over time.
Yes, yeah, that's certainly, yeah, that's something that, and like I said, that's the one area that tends to get organizations in trouble with the state, if the state comes in and the comptroller's office comes in, and as long as you adhere to those guidelines that I gave you, that's right out of the law. As a matter of fact, to try to help you a little bit, I gave Anthony the 2 sections that apply to the fire service. I can send up to you all 4 sections, so, I mean, you can look it up yourself, of course, but I'll make it easy on you. I'll give you all 4 sections. And as I said, the only variance is really between the ambulance corps and the fire service is some of the points. Other than that, the language is almost identical.
Okay.
All right?
Thanks. I think you're not going to have to come back perhaps as much as you think. We have, I was going to say tapes, but they're not tapes anymore, but all of these meetings are available on our website.
Okay.
So people can stream it whenever they feel like it, and it also replays on the local cable channels,
All right,
government
great.
channels. So,
Well, honestly, Mr. Mayor,
so
we
your-
want to make this
your
work for you, so.
explanations was like, well, no, the guy said something about that. Go listen to Bob, and it's like at minute 87, and
If,
so it's
but if you want us to, I mean, to do it right, at least to do it where it works for you folks and to make this thing go
Uh-huh.
smoothly, we have no problem making a presentation to the fire department, the individual guys, or I believe, if it's acceptable to you, they've asked us to meet with the wardens, is that?
Fire warden.
Fire wardens?
yeah, that
Next Monday to
yeah,
explain to 'em?
that's. I'm thinking there's 2 things here. One is we need to look at the numbers and decide what we want to do. If we want to do, I should say, if and then what. But assuming for the moment that we choose to go forward and adopt a plan, meeting with the members is something that I see as very
Yeah.
separate,
Yeah, that can be
different
done.
than.
Yeah, but one of
meeting
the
with the
things that
public.
I would say is before we start arranging for a company like yours to meet with the wardens, is that we're doing our own vetting process around different companies that offer this service.
Okay.
So I don't want to have like 10 different or 5 different vendors coming to speak to the wardens, to speak to us. I would prefer to have, work that out with the fire department and then let you guys know, okay, this is when it's appropriate to come and
That's
pitch
fine.
to them.
We're just trying to be cooperative, so
Yeah.
if you don't want us to meet with them yet, that's fine.
Yeah, that would be my preference.
That's fine, yeah. So we're available, like I said, to answer any further questions you might have. Once I get the actuarial report, it'll give you at least some ideas on the costs associated with it, with the assumptions that we made. All right, and then, of course, we can always change the assumptions.
This
All
is very helpful.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay.
This is really helpful.
Good. I think we kind of work on the premise that keeping you informed, coming up and doing a detailed review, so you really understand the dollars and so forth once we do a report. That's what we pride ourselves in. And as I said, we do over 200 of these programs, so it's not,
It's very necessary what you've done, because it's a big program for the village.
of course, yeah.
While everybody is feeling very positive about it, at the same time, we don't have the numbers in front of us.
Right. Well, that's why, at least as a first step, hopefully you understand these programs a little bit more tonight now.
Yes.
I have just one quick question.
Yeah.
What are some of the other fire companies or fire districts municipalities that you work with in Westchester County that you guys?
There's quite a few. As a matter of fact, if you want, I can get you a list of
Just off the
some.
top
That
of your
would
head,
be-
if you remember.
Well, the closest
Well,
one,
Elmsford.
Elmsford is
Okay.
I've been
one.
doing Elmsford for 10 years.
I was just over a week ago, let me make sure I got, South Orangetown Ambulance Corps.
Okay, that's,
They're just on the other side of the river.
That's on the other side.
Yeah, Woodbury Ambulance Corps is another one that's up here. Fire departments would be Rombart. Let's see.
We're looking for a big name.
Elmsford's big.
Lake Carmel.
Elmsford's close.
Lake Carmel is a little bit further up.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You kind of catch me.
We'll get the list.
Yeah, I can get you a list. I mean,
Okay.
we do
Yeah.
quite.
I'm
Why
just
you didn't get
curious.
any Westchester?
Nothing
But,
Westchester?
no, so-
We could do that, so Suffolk
Elmsford-
County from the back
Elmsford,
of
that's
my-
it.
Give me another Westchester. Can't you think of any?
Don't worry, we'll get.
All right, we'll get you the list, no problem.
Oh, I'm sorry. That's fine.
All
Okay.
right, so we'll provide that to you. All right, well, thank you for your time.
Bob, Vincent, thank you. It's been
Thank
very
you, gentlemen.
Thank you, guys.
Have a pleasant-
If we don't see you, have a happy holiday.
Thank you.
Thank you.
For you guys tomorrow, so. Okay. Or email. And I'll talk to Larry.
All right, we're going to move on to our next discussion item. And just having holiday wishes. This is a nice segue, bagging the parking meters. Mr. Giacchio, what did we do last year? When did we start? When did we end?
We started a little earlier, ended around the same time as this draft resolution. This was Chief of Police's recommendation. You could obviously change the dates if you want. By the way, Chief sends his regards. He had a personal matter. Couldn't make it tonight.
Why does he want to start midweek?
That was because the assumption is you would adopt it on Tuesday next week.
Oh, I see. Okay. Gotcha.
Or you could adopt it tonight and pick the date.
Like
Well, to
weekend.
Do that.
So is this what we did last year?
We
went
did a
to
little
January
longer.
4th?
We felt it was too long.
It was
We
too
did it
long
longer.
last
We
year.
did almost December
It was like,
1st, I think.
it was
So-
like the 8th or something like
Yeah.
that last
But
year.
one of the things I thought we decided was right after Christmas to end it
It's
last year.
usually New
Do you have the
Year's.
resolution from last year?
Pretty sure it was after January 1st, but I could be mistaken. I'd have to go
Maybe
back
it was
and look.
January 1st, Anthony. Okay, I want to make sure, because I know compared to Tarrytown, we used to do it like an extra week,
Right.
and the holidays were pretty much,
Yeah, it's too
everybody got
long.
out of the mode. But if January 4th falls, I don't know, why January 4th? Is that a
It's
Monday?
that Saturday
That was
after.
the Saturday.
Look, we can do whatever,
If this is what the chief's recommending, that's fine.
I don't think I think he would defer to the board if they had a different
But
opinion.
last year, we did make a change to cut it back on the back end, actually.
So if you want to do it till the 1st, the last day, is that what you're suggesting?
That's what I think we did last year,
Wednesday?
but I'm
Yeah.
not positive.
That's, I mean, if, I'm fine with that.
I know in Tarrytown, the bags come off pretty quick, but, you know, we're a little different.
in a wonderful way.
You don't remember what it was last year?
I just know it was longer.
It was late last year.
We did it longer.
It was
and
too late.
it was-
Well, we could still discuss it, that's what we're doing, so.
Yeah, yeah.
If you just, if you could pull up last year's resolution, because that worked pretty good. I'd just be curious to see what we did it up until.
So
Last year's was too long.
let's
So
put it
when is he-
on for next
reduced
week, okay? And we'll nail down the length of time sometime between now
Yeah.
and then.
Just a quick question. The chief is recommending that it start next week?
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay, everybody? Good? All right. Next item, bids for the East Parcel Water Line.
I mentioned this last week in my report. This is the water line that goes under the train tracks to the west parcel. It's the village has taken over that, and we did put it in our capital budget. We just want to go out to bid on it, and the board will have the option to accept the bids or not.
Okay. Is the bid package ready?
Yes, yeah.
Is there any reason to wait?
No.
You guys want to go into a special session just so we can at least get the bid package out there
Sure.
before it gets, submerged in the holidays? Okay, can I get a motion to go into special session
So
for the
moved.
purpose of considering this one resolution?
So moved.
Is there a second? Moved and seconded. All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? All right, this is a special session of the Board of Trustees called for the purpose of considering a resolution to solicit bids, authorizing the administrator to solicit bids for the East Parcel Water Project. Somebody I think I just read the resolution. Could somebody read it anyway, please?
Resolution of the Board of Trustees of the Village of Sleepy Hollow authorizing the village administrator to solicit bids for the East Parcel Waterline Project. Whereas the village administrator has requested permission to solicit bids for the East Parcel Waterline Project, and whereas specifications for this work have been completed by Dolph Rotfeld Engineering, now therefore be it resolved that the mayor and the Board of Trustees of the Village of Sleepy Hollow authorizes the village administrator to solicit bids for the East Parcel Waterline Project. So moved.
Seconded.
Moved and seconded. Any discussion? All in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed or abstentions? Resolution's approved. Can I get a motion to end the special session?
So moved. Seconded.
Moved and seconded. All in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? And, all right, the special session is ended. We're back in our work session, and our business is finished for the evening. Thank you and good night.